All right, hey everybody, Joe here from Avalon, and today I'd like to tell you about one of the most common issues we see when it comes to small business owners hiring employees. And that issue is whether the worker is an employee or an independent contractor. I'll talk about the differences between hiring an employee and hiring a contractor, and I'll also explain how to identify which you've hired. I'll also explain the obligations that business owners have when hiring each type of worker and why it matters. Finally, I'll discuss whether it's better to hire an employee or a contractor for your business. So all that and nothing else coming right up. All right, first, let's break down the difference between an employee and a contractor. At a high level, a contractor is a self-employed person that you hire to do a specific job. And that job may be short-term, could be part-time, or just sporadic in nature. Usually a contractor will fill a specific gap in your team that's either specialized or not large enough to warrant a full-time employee. You pay them a set amount to do a specific job and don't take on any regulatory requirements like CPP, tax withheld, or EI. Alternatively, an employee is someone that's dedicated to working for you. Because of the nature of the work they do, you take on all the regulatory requirements that an employee entails. There's actually a lot more gray area to this than people expect, but we'll get into that shortly. Now, when determining if you are working with an employee or a contractor, there usually isn't a black and white answer. The key question is whether the worker is carrying on services as a person in business for himself, a contractor, or working for you as an employee. To figure out which worker type that you have, a number of factors must be considered. Then the entire working relationship as a whole can be used to make the final determination. Now, we typically can't just point to one or two things and say, hey, Dwight sets his own schedule, so he must be a contractor. We have to look at everything and often use professional judgment to come up with the final answer. I know it's tough to have professional judgment when you've just learned about the issue, but there are some resources available to help you with this, and I'll discuss those in a minute here. All right, so let's start with the factors that must be considered. Employee or contractor. The factors to consider are, number one, intention. What was the intent of the working relationship when it began? 2, control. Who controls how and when the work is done? 3, tools and equipment. Who provides the tools to do the job? 4, subcontracting work. Can the worker hire an assistant or subcontractor to help them complete the job? Financial risk and reward. Does the worker have any financial risk, or on the flip side, any opportunity for profit? And lastly, investment. Is the worker required to make any investment in order to provide the services? All right, we'll start with intention. The first question to ask is, what was the intention when the working relationship was established? Did the two parties intend to enter an employer and employee relationship, or was it intended to be a business relationship? This is known as either a contract of service, employer-employee, or a contract for services, which is a business relationship. The intent of both parties is a good starting point, but intent in reality can often be very different. For example, both parties may have intended for the services to be provided as a contractor, but the actual facts point to an employer-employee relationship, and this is a pretty common scenario. After looking at intention, the remaining factors will either help support this or will reveal the actual form of the relationship. Next question to answer is who controls when and how the work is done. This is a key factor in determining the working relationship, so we want to assess the degree of control or independence on the other side. If the business owner has more control over how and when the work is done, this points towards an employer-employee relationship. But if the worker has more control over how and when the work is done, this points towards an independent contractor relationship. So again, let's look at some examples here. So first up is whether the business owner will direct where and when the work is accomplished. For example, if we told Dwight that we wanted him to work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday at the Scranton branch, that points to an employer-employee relationship. If Dwight sets his own schedule and work location, that points more towards him being a contractor. The next control indicator is whether or not the business owner dictates how the work is to be completed and the expected results of the work. So going back to our example, when we tell Dwight that he has to make cold calls every day and we actually want him to call 100 leads per day, this points to Dwight being an employee. If we just said, hey, Dwight, sell some paper for us, and left the rest up to him, that points towards him being a contractor. The amount of pay and payment method are also indicators of control. If we told Dwight that he would receive $20 per hour plus 5% commissions, we're controlling the amount and method of pay, which points to an employer-employee relationship. I'm going to say that a lot. If instead Dwight tells us that, hey, my rate is $50 per hour and I'm going to send you an invoice for my hours, that points to him being a contractor. The last control indicator I'll mention is whether or not the worker requires permission to take on other work. If we expect Dwight to only sell paper for us and no other business, then that points to an employee relationship. If Dwight is free to take on other jobs while working for us, that makes it look like he's more of an independent contractor. So those are the main control indicators that we'll look at in this video. For a few more examples, you can check out the article linked in the description below. All right, so the next factor to consider is who provides the tools and equipment necessary to complete the job. Generally speaking, an employer will provide tools and equipment for his employees, whereas contractors will have their own equipment. It's true that employees do sometimes have to provide their own tools to complete their work, which is why this is just one of many factors to consider. So let's first look at a few examples where the situation points to an employer-employee relationship. If the business owner supplies most of the tools and equipment needed to complete the work, the business owner is responsible for maintenance and upkeep of the tools and equipment. The business owner owns and retains the right to use the equipment. The worker is reimbursed for any equipment purchases that he makes. On the other hand, if the worker provides the tools and is responsible for repairs and maintenance, then that points to an independent contractor relationship. All right, next up, we look at whether or not the worker can hire an assistant or subcontract the work to someone else. Generally, employees cannot hire an assistant or subcontract their work, whereas a contractor can. So going back to our example, Dwight looks more like an employee if we tell him that he has to do all the work and he can't hire someone else to do it. If we allow Dwight to hire his cousin Mose to make the cold calls for him, then Dwight looks more like an independent contractor. All right, next up, we will need to understand whether the worker has either financial risk or opportunity for profit from the working relationship. Employees don't normally have a risk of loss for completing their work. Employees also usually have a set amount of pay that they'll receive for completing their service, so there's no opportunity for extra profit. If the worker has a risk of losing money and has an opportunity to earn profit, then this indicates a contractor relationship rather than employer-employee relationship. For example, let's say that our worker Dwight hired his cousin Mose to make cold calls for him at $5 per call. This puts Dwight at risk of a loss. If Mose makes no sales, Dwight might not earn enough to cover the cost of hiring Mose. All right, the last factor we'll look at is whether the worker is required to make any investment in order to provide the services. A significant investment is evidence that the relationship is one of an independent contractor and not of an employer and an employee. For example, if Dwight had to purchase a cell phone, a fax machine, a list of leads to make his cold calls, that is a potentially significant indicator that points to him being an independent contractor. But if we provide all that stuff and Dwight can just show up and dial, then that looks more like an employer-employee relationship. Now that you've looked at all the factors, it's time to make a determination. Have you hired an employee or a contractor? As I mentioned before, making this determination requires considering the working relationship as a whole. The conclusion is based on all the factors and may also be subject to interpretation requiring some professional judgment. If all the factors indicate one type of working relationship, then it's quite clear that you can proceed. Unfortunately, it's not always clear after looking at the whole picture. So you may find that a worker sets his own schedule and uses his own tools. However, he has no control over how the work is completed and he isn't able to hire an assistant. That's two indicators each way. So what now? Thankfully, there's help available to make that determination. If after reviewing all of the factors, you're not sure of the working relationship, you can contact CRA and request a ruling. So there are a couple of ways that you can do this. If you have a My Business account set up with CRA, you can use the Request a CPPEI ruling link in there to start that process on that side. You can also mail in a form. So a business owner or authorized representative can fill out a form called the Request a Ruling form and send it to CRA for that ruling. If you've already hired your worker, there is a time limit for sending the ruling request. So the deadline is June 30 of the following year. So for example, if you've requested a ruling for 2022, the ruling must be requested by June 30, 2023. Another way to make the determination is to consult with an accountant. So your accountant can help you review the factors and use his or her professional judgment to guide you. All right, so we'll get into the pros and cons from the standpoint of the business owner. But first, we'll look at the differences between how contractors and employees are treated in some key areas. So number one is payroll remittances. Employers are required to withhold and remit payroll deductions for their employees, but this is not the case when hiring contractors. Canada Pension Plan. Employees generally pay into CPP, which allows the employee to collect Canada Pension when they retire. This adds a cost to the employer because a matching employer CPP contribution is required. There is no CPP cost for business owners hiring a contractor. Employment insurance. Employees also generally pay into EI, which helps them qualify for EI benefits. This also adds cost to the employer as there is an employer portion of EI to be paid. There is no cost for EI for business owners hiring a contractor. Vacation pay. There are requirements for employers to pay a minimum amount of vacation pay to employees, but this is not the case when paying a contractor. Workers' compensation, WorkSafe or WCB premiums are paid on employee wages, but WorkSafe payments aren't required to be paid when you've hired a contractor who is separately registered for a WorkSafe program. Termination and severance pay. There are specific guidelines and requirements for severance pay when terminating an employee, but this is not the case for hiring a contractor. Overtime pay. There are also requirements to pay a higher rate during overtime work for employees, but this is not required when you're paying a contractor. So now that we understand the regulatory differences, we can begin to see some pros and cons of hiring employees versus contractors, but which one is better? So we'll get into that next. Before moving on to which is better for your business, a word from me. So we have no sponsor, so I'll take a moment to ask if you have enjoyed this video or enjoying this video or any other videos that we've put out, please drop us a like now or consider subscribing if you want to see more of our content. Also, if you want to hear from me specifically, I send out a weekly email about running a small business in Canada, some of my own experiences and experiences with clients that we have. So consider signing up for that as well below. All right, so back to the question at hand. As a business owner, which type of worker is better? Now, there won't be a definitive answer that applies to everyone, but we can look at the benefits for each and decide from there. So there's some benefits to hiring a contractor versus hiring an employee. Lower costs. It's often less expensive to hire a worker as a contractor and not an employee. This is because the payer doesn't have to pay for CPP, EI, vacation, overtime, severance pay, WorkSafe, all those things. Less administrative work. So with employees, you have to remit payroll deductions, prepare T4s, and also file ROEs when the employees quit. With contractors, you can just hire for the job, pay the contractor's invoice, and move on. More flexible. It's generally easier to hire a contract for short-term work or for a specific job than to hire an employee. On the flip side, there are also some benefits to hiring an employee and having that employer-employee relationship. Long-term work. If you have an ongoing need for a worker, hiring an employee will usually fit that role much better than a contractor. It's also a more permanent type of relationship and could be a better choice if you want someone for the long term. Building knowledge in the business. Hiring employees allows you to retain talent and knowledge within your business. And if you hire a skilled contractor, they can just leave with their knowledge and skills once the job is done. Training and supervision. If the work needs to be done in a specific way, hiring an employee will give you greater control over how and when the work is completed. Lastly, loyalty. Well-treated employees, and I can attest to this, can be loyal and hardworking assets to your business. So boiling this down, we can say that it's generally more expensive to hire an employee. However, if you're looking for a long-term worker who can be trained and will build knowledge within your business, an employee may be your best option. All right, so that's a wrap on this video explaining the differences between employees and contractors. Hopefully you've got a better understanding of the issue and can set up your working relationships appropriately from the beginning. If you've already hired someone, that's okay too. Our recommended first step is to reach out to your accountant for some guidance on whether you need to make any changes there. We're also happy to answer any general questions in the comments below, so please don't hesitate to leave us a question down there. We also want to help as many business owners as possible, and these videos are one of the ways we get to do that. So if you've enjoyed this video or it has been helpful for you, please hit the like button. And if you like content like this or are a small business owner in Canada yourself, please consider subscribing. We really appreciate all the support that we get. So thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.